July 2026. We're looking at what might be one of the most dramatic, high-stakes pieces of economic legislation in recent memory, and it was born out of a sudden tragedy. Welcome to our explainer on the Russia Sanctions Bill, a policy so massive and far-reaching, it honestly reads a bit like a geopolitical thriller. Let's dive right in. So just look at this unprecedented timeline. On July 12th, Senator Lindsey Graham suddenly passes away. Fast forward literally just 4 days, and Senate Bill 5025 is introduced. Then by July 28th, right after a closed-door appeal by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the Senate advances the bill 86-12. I mean, that is a staggering level of bipartisan consensus, setting the stage for what could be a massive global shockwave.
Now, you might have seen this number floating around. The media absolutely fixated on this eye-watering 500% tariff. But here's why we really need to look closer. That giant number? It only applies to goods imported directly from Russia into the US. And realistically, that specific trade route is already pretty much extinct. So, while it makes for a great headline, it's not the actual weapon here.
Actually, scratch that first number, because the crucial point is this second, far more consequential one, 100%. This is the threat that is so massive, the entire global oil market is practically holding its breath right now to see if the trigger can actually be pulled. Because this isn't about direct trade with Russia. Oh no, this is about targeting the rest of the world.
Okay, moving to Section 113, let's break down the real threat.
Keep in mind, the House of Representatives is actually in recess until August 31st, so this threat is fully built but not yet the law of the land. But man, Section 113 authorizes those 100% tariffs with unbelievable precision. It specifically targets the top 5 international importers of Russian crude oil and natural gas if they make new purchases after a 30-day grace period. It also goes after the facilitators of the so-called shadow fleet, those aging tankers actively evading sanctions. But here's the kicker. Tucked right inside this very mechanism is a presidential national interest waiver, basically a built-in release valve. We'll come back to why that's so important in a minute.
Next up, let's look at the arithmetic and see who's actually buying the oil.
To really wrap our heads around the blast radius of this geopolitical weapon, we have to understand the sheer velocity of the market shift. Before 2022, Russian crude accounted for less than 1% of India's oil imports. It barely even registered. But consider where things stand now. By March 2026, it skyrocketed to 47%, and by June, India was importing a record-breaking 2.6 million barrels a day from Russia. Now, New Delhi has been very public about this, stating it's simply about securing the energy needs of their 1.4 billion citizens.
And the picture comes completely into focus when you factor China into the equation. China actually overtook India as Moscow's largest seaborne crude customer in late 2025, taking in roughly 2 million barrels a day themselves. Combine those figures, just 2 countries are consuming between 75 and 80% of Russia's total crude flow. That is 3/4 of the entire pie. And that incredible concentration is exactly why Section 113 is designed the way it is. It might officially name 5 countries, but everyone knows it's really designed to corner just 2.
So, moving on to the mechanics. How do you deal with moving 4 million barrels? Well, here is the huge mechanical problem at the core of all this. Oil is a heavy, physical commodity. You need specialized ships, highly configured refineries, and just massive, massive infrastructure to move it around. It's not a bank account. You can't just freeze it with a quick keystroke. Which leads us to a really tense question. If Section 113 works exactly as intended, and both India and China step back to avoid that 100% tariff, where do those roughly 4 million barrels a day literally go? They can't just vanish into thin air.
Right, so there are realistically only 2 physical outcomes here. It's a fork in the road. Path 1, the barrels are diverted, meaning Russia is forced to scramble and sell to other buyers at an even more extreme discount. The revenue drops, which is obviously the US's goal, but the oil keeps flowing. Path 2, the barrels are genuinely blocked from the market. But if 4 million barrels a day suddenly disappear from the global pool, world supply violently tightens up. And if that happens, fuel prices are going to skyrocket for everyone, hitting American and European consumers right where it hurts the most, at the pump.
Let's look at the repercussions. I like to call this the $100 billion hammer.
See, the domestic consequences of pulling this trigger don't stop at the gas pump. A 100% tax on major global economies is definitely not a surgical scalpel. It is an absolute sledgehammer taken directly to the American supply chain. Think about the scale of this exposure. In 2025, total two-way goods trade between the U.S. and India was almost $150 billion. U.S. imports alone made up nearly $104 billion of that.
If the government enacts a 100% tariff, it literally doubles the landed cost of all those goods. That kind of shockwave instantly reverberates through American pharmacies, manufacturing floors, and your local retail shelves. In a way, you'd be taxing the American consumer just to penalize the foreign buyer.
And what's wild is, we kind of already know how this plays out in the real world, because a lighter version of this was already tried. Back in August 2025, Washington placed a 50% tariff on Indian goods, explicitly tying half of it to Russian oil purchases. So what happened? Well, within 6 months, the two governments hashed out a trade deal, and the oil penalty was completely withdrawn. And after that, India's Russian crude imports didn't stop, they actually grew to absolute record levels by June.
This brings us to a huge debate. Does this tactic actually work?
Because of that history we just talked about, there are two entirely coherent but totally opposed ways to view this new legislation. The first camp insists that, yes, this absolutely works, just maybe not in the way you'd think. Supporters argue that the sheer, terrifying threat of a 100% tariff forces highly risk-averse commercial actors, we're talking big banks, insurers, shipping giants, to quietly de-risk and comply before the bill is even signed. The threat alone changes behavior in the boardroom long before it becomes law. But on the flip side, critics argue the bill relies on a structural trap that simply cannot be used. They say a biting tariff just structurally boosts global oil prices, punishes U.S. consumers, and, ironically, increases Russia's revenue for every remaining barrel they manage to sell.
So let's talk about the deterrent. Essentially, a loaded weapon.
This intense back-and-forth debate reveals a strange catch-22 woven right into the fabric of the act. It's a piece of legislation designed to be so catastrophic that it acts as the ultimate deterrent. Remember that presidential waiver we mentioned earlier? It allows the executive branch to bypass the tariff if they certify it's in the national interest. In this context, that waiver is absolutely not a loophole. It might actually be the most functional, critical clause in the entire bill. Why? Because it allows the threat to remain permanently cocked, but permanently unspent. Think about it. A 100% tariff on $100 billion of trade isn't really a tax. It's a threat to completely sever an economic relationship. And a threat of that magnitude is that it's absolute most powerful in the exact moment before anyone finds out if it will actually be carried through. Once you impose the tariff, the bluff is called. At that point, either the global economy suffers a massive, crippling supply shock, or the oil simply shifts into those opaque shadow channels, completely exposing the U.S. threat as hollow.
So as we wait to see what the House of Representatives does when they return this September, we're left with a really provocative question. If a weapon is too catastrophic to ever be practically deployed, does it still hold power? Or is it really only the shape of a weapon? The honest answer, nobody truly knows, for sure, because a secondary tariff of this sheer magnitude has never actually been tried. Thanks for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning the mechanics behind the headlines, and we'll see you next time.